I grabbed the stamped folder before the clerk could push it through the tray. The wooden tray scraped as my hand closed over paper that smelled of dust and lamp oil. Suspicion pulled at my fingers. I had followed minor oddities for months, and this one tightened that thread. Evelyn, Samuel from the doorway, voice low and sharp. "You know that's not for the reading room now." I did know. The stamped rectangle read access before sunset in block letters. The tray slid back into the cart with a soft clack, and the lamps along the main room were already going lower. I folded the corner of the folder with my thumb the way I always did when a file felt important. I set the folder on the table and breathed once, slow. The first 5 minutes after a seizure like that decide how far I will press. My suspicion shaped my choice. I could hand the folder back and leave the rule untested. Instead, I moved my chair closer to the lamp and called for Amira. Amira arrived with her satchel swinging, sleeves dusted with index card grit. She saw the stamp and did not ask why. She pushed her hair behind her ear, sat, and placed her palm flat on the folder as if checking it for heat. "Why before sunset?" she asked. Her question was short. It demanded an answer from the room and from me. We opened the file. Redactions were neat and heavy. Lines of type had been overlaid with black rectangles that left only bare hints. Dates, single words like withdrawal, and a place name. A stamped instruction folded into the margin read, "Do not permit access after dusk." Handwritten notes crowded the edge in cramped, impatient script. "See ledger. Schedule attached." I traced the margin with my fingertip. My curiosity shifted into method. I marked the page and photographed the unredacted portions. The camera battery flashed low and then died. The lamplight stuttered once and the bulb hummed. When Mr. Blyther pushed his cart into the doorway, the lamps dimmed again. He had the posture of someone bearing a predictable weight. "Miss Markham," he said, and his voice carried the slow certainty of the head archivist. "Those folders leave the room before dark for a reason. You know the rules." He placed a gloved hand on the cart, and the cart smelled of oil and wood. "Blythe," I said, and I kept my tone measured. "Why the cut-off at dusk? What do you mean by not after dark?" Mr. Blythe's mouth tightened. Amira watched his hands, the nails, the way he counted the folders with his thumb. "It's custodial," he said. "It keeps the stacks in order. It protects fragile material." Nothing more. His eyes did not move to the stamp. He pushed the cart and the room shifted. The night guard Samuel stood a step behind him, shoulders broad, breath visible in the cold draft that came through a cracked window. "Evelyn Samuel," and the name had a caution to it now. He reached for the cart tray. I moved my hand over the stamped folder and did not let go. That was the first clear action of refusal. That was the first time the suspicion turned to stubbornness. We argued while lamps lowered. The argument was compact, made of short lines. "Give it back, Samuel." "Not tonight," I answered. "Mr. Blythe, Amira, is there a ledger?" Blythe looked at the two of us as if evaluating risk. "There is an index procedure. Certain items are withdrawn according to schedule. You are not authorized to pursue it after hours." He did not sound like a man offering explanation. The camera on the table had died. I took out my notebook and copied the few visible words. My pen made a small, precise scratch on the paper. I wrote the stamped date and the marginal note. I folded a slip and slipped it into my coat. I could have left the folder on the table with a polite apology and a promise to return tomorrow. Instead, I listened to the thinness in Mr. Blythe's voice and the firmness in Samuel's stance and made another choice. That night I persuaded Amira to hide. We moved through the stacks as the last public reader left and the front doors closed. We wore our coats and kept our thin brass lamps in pockets. My heart rate increased only a little, and that little registered as heat in my palms. Suspicion shifted into determination. We ducked into the cloakroom, locked the outer door with a pin from my satchel, and waited until the building settled into the soft, constant sound of a sleeping institution. Pipes murmuring, a distant cart wheel, paper breathing in shelves. We kept to a steady plan. Amira would watch the stairwell. I would slip past the locked staff gates and follow the record of the stamped folder to its origin. We had spoken of risks in low, efficient sentences. "If Samuel sees motions after hours, he will stop us. Amira, if Blythe knows, he will lock everything down." Her voice was even. She was sharp and precise. "Then we are quiet and we leave quickly," I said. We put the folder back into my satchel for weight and moved. The stacks smelled like cold glue and cloth. My fingers brushed spines that carried accession numbers. The index alcove had a metal cabinet of cards, some cards removed, older tabs missing. I slid my hand into a gap and felt a hollow where a card had been. The hole in the index was a physical absence. It made the issue immediate. I pulled a neighboring card and read the handwritten entry. The cross-references had been erased with a razor. I set the small lamp on the floor and the light pooled on the index table. I tried to photograph the suspect entry. The camera refused. The battery icon blinked once and went dark. A lamp overhead clicked as someone in the hall adjusted the dimmer. The lamplight stuttered and went lower. Amira hissed and the sound was short and sharp. We both heard a footstep outside the alcove. Samuel's silhouette blocked the doorway when we slid into the adjacent corridor. This area is closed, he kept his voice controlled. He kept his hand near his belt. For names. I gave mine slowly. He watched my fingers when I put the satchel on the table. Leave the building, he said. Now I did not move. My jaw tightened. The tension in my shoulders was a clear signal of fear. Fear, in that moment, replaced determination for an instant. Then I steadied. I told Samuel we had permission from Mr. Blythe. He looked at me and at the satchel and then at the lamp. His eyes narrowed. We gave him a partial truth. Mr. Blythe had been in the doorway earlier, and that gave us plausible cause. Samuel hesitated and his hand did not move away from his belt. He wanted to avoid the smallest risk. We used the pause he gave. Amira shifted the satchel to her shoulder. We moved before he could fully block us. We slipped past in the narrow gap between stacks and held our breath. Beyond the stacks, a false panel awaited under a row of brittle reference volumes. I had found it by accident months before, a hairline seam along the shelf. The seam gave under a small push and revealed a narrow room no larger than a broom closet. In its center lay a ledger on a wooden stool. The ledger was simple. The leather cover had been worked thin where hands had rubbed it. Names and dates were written in a compact, bureaucratic hand. There was a column marked withdrawal time and another simply marked authority. Someone had used a heavy lead pencil to note the dusk hour beside many entries. Miss Blythe arrived while I was reading the ledger. He did not knock. He did not need to. He stepped into the small room with the soft certainty of someone who had moved among these stacks for 30 years. You should not be here, he said. His voice was close and there was a small impatience in it. Amira held the lamp and the light showed 2 small lines at the corner of his eyes. I used the ledger to ask direct questions. Mr. Blythe, these entries show names and times. Why is the withdrawal time set at dusk for these items? I kept my voice steady. I put my palm flat on a page as if testing the paper. He closed his mouth and did not answer immediately. He looked at the ledger and then at Amira. It is custodial practice, he said again. He folded his hands over the ledger as if to hide it. That was not a refusal I could accept. My fingers were steady, but my throat went dry mid-a. Blythe, I said, is there a person who must see these items at dusk? Why these hours? He inhaled and the sound was precise. Miss Markham, archival duty often comes down to that which is manageable. Some items require removal to preserve the collection. Some require supervised access. The reasons are not for casual explanation. He closed the ledger and placed a finger on a name. The name belonged to a local relief committee from 20 years prior. The withdrawal times corresponded to a narrow list of families and sworn representatives. At a glance it seemed municipal. Then Amira tapped a line and pointed at an annotation. The annotation read, "Person assigned, see note." The note itself was folded into a tiny corner and scribbled in a different hand. "Evening only, do not permit after dark." I felt something shift in my understanding of procedure. Doubt turned to alarm. Who wrote the note? I asked. Mr. Blythe's face tightened. Custodial staff and trustees handle annotations. You must speak to them through formal channels. His tone implied it was final. Amira, Blythe, the policy is a rule, but the notes read like orders. Did someone decide this because of security, or because of people? He did not answer directly. He lifted his chin. It is not for the public record. That is enough. His hands closed over the ledger and his thumb left a slight smear of graphite. We pressed anyway. The ledger offered concrete names. I copied a name onto my notebook. I wrote the time beside it, dusk. I wrote down the annotation. My pen acted as if it had a purpose. The ledger's paper had indentations from previous notes. Someone had used a heavy hand for emphasis on certain entries. The pattern suggested a schedule not of items but of appearances. They closed in on us then. Samuel came down the corridor with his lamp and a second guard, faster than I expected. The light swung and my eyes burned. Miss Markham, Samuel, and his voice had a sharper edge. Step away from that ledger. His hand reached for Blythe's shoulder. Blythe, we should leave this. Hands off official records. The conversation multiplied into quick lines. Names called, orders given, a cart rolled. The struggle was brief and specific. Samuel took hold of the ledger to remove it. I pushed with my shoulder and attempted to slide the ledger back toward me. Amira placed herself between Samuel and the ledger and said, "Samuel, stop. Let us speak to Mr. Blythe." "Do not touch the records." Her voice had a firmness that was different from my own. She used his name like a steadying rope. He hesitated. In the pause I saw Mr. Blythe make a choice. He did not reach for the ledger to take it away. He closed the ledger and tucked it under his arm instead. There are reasons some files are seen only before sunset. It is a custodial necessity and a safety measure. He looked at each of us. His eyes stayed on me longer than on Amira. "Miss Markham, you will not pursue this tonight." He turned and walked away. I felt the air tighten in my chest. Short breaths, the texture of a held moment. That physical tightening was fear moving through muscle. My hands trembled as I folded the notebook and returned it to my satchel. Amira's jaw clenched, but she relaxed her shoulders and spoke softly. "We will come back," she said. "We will follow the ledger. We will ask the trustees for the access logs." Her language was procedural. Her determination steadied me. We left the small room and the ledger returned to its false panel. The cart moved along the corridor like a slow animal. Blythe had shifted the balance of authority by asserting his custodial phrase, yet his avoidance of explanation became a hint. His refusal had a particular cadence. It felt deliberate. I felt suspicion deepen into a clearer shape. Someone used dusk to control who could see specific names and times. I decided then to force the schedule. I would not rely on camera batteries or formal requests. I would follow the mechanism that removed the folder. That meant being present when the restricted stack opened and choosing a direct action. The decision moved through me like a sequence of tight, practical steps. Identify the stack, find the door, plan the moment. I told Amira the plan and she listened without smiling. "We will be careful," she said. "We will not get caught." Her sentence was not a promise, it was a rule. We returned after the staff left and the building settled. The iron door to the restricted stack had a heavy bar and a keyhole darkened by years of use. The cart that had held the stamped folders earlier had emptied into a small room behind the door. A hinge had a faint squeak that sounded like a hinge. I put my ear against the metal and heard nothing but distant city noise. My fingers reached for the small brass key I kept on a leather thong. The key felt familiar in my palm. It felt like an instrument of choice. Samuel intercepted us in the narrow corridor as we tried the staff entrance. He stepped in front of the door with his lamp angled to show his face. "I told you to leave," he said. He did not raise his voice. He kept his hands at his sides. Amira stepped forward and said, "Samuel, please, we have questions about an index entry. We want to examine the stack briefly and return." He studied her. He studied my face. Blythe does not want anyone back there tonight." He put his hand on the iron door to check the latch. The door locked as if to answer him. Machine and hinge had the final say. The key would not turn because the internal bolt had been set from the other side. That small fact changed everything. Amira pressed a palm to the iron and said, "Someone is on the other side." Her voice dropped. I felt a new prick of alarm. This was no longer just paperwork and procedure. It had become an action that implied a watching person. Blythe's footsteps came again faster than I expected. He arrived breathless with the ledger folded under his arm. He did not open his mouth at once. He set the ledger on the floor and placed his hand over it as if to hold it in place. "I told you this was custodial," he said. "There are people who cannot be exposed to certain records at night. It is about privacy and dignity." His words sounded like a shield. He looked away from the iron door as if to avoid what might stand beyond it. I asked, "Privacy for whom, Mr. Blythe?" My voice was a direct line. He did not answer quickly. He instead produced a small, folded note and slid it across the ledger. The note had a single line. "Do not step into the room when it is occupied. Return at dawn. The instruction read like a command from someone who had authority beyond the archive. The small note changed how the ledger read. The schedule now meant presence. Samuel's shoulder tightened. "We are custodians of the public record," he said. "We protect people and materials. Miss Markham, you will step back." Amira did not step back. She held the lamp high and said, "Samuel, who is allowed inside when the room is occupied." "Give me a name." He looked at Mr. Blythe, who looked at the ledger. Blither drew a slow breath and said, "Authorized representatives, trustees, and designated counsel. On occasion, community liaisons come at dusk for consultations." His voice lowered further. "That is all I will say tonight." The room's silence pressed on the three of us. I felt my pulse in the side of my neck. A shift moved through me from fear into a sharpened resolve. I made a choice I had prepared for. I stepped toward the iron door and placed my hand on the cold metal bolt. Blythe watched. Samuel moved his feet as if to block. Amira touched my elbow and whispered, "Evelyn, think." I looked at her, then at the ledger at Blythe's feet. "I told them I would open the door." The sentence landed like an action rather than a speech. Blythe's face changed. Samuel's jaw tightened. "Blythe, Miss Markham, you cannot open that door. You will not open that door." He reached for his pocket and brought out a thin brass key on a ring. He held it up between us like evidence. "This key is assigned. The door is unlocked under supervision. That supervision happens before night falls for specific reasons of safety and consent." He did not say more. I slipped my fingers into my satchel and brought out the small slip I had folded earlier from the ledger annotation. It had a smudged name. I read it aloud. "Thomas Reed, Community Liaison, withdrawal at dusk. Authorized representative. Return at dawn." I set the paper on Blythe's ledger. "If the names correspond to living people, who gives the order that limits access?" I asked. My voice was steady and precise. Blythe's eyes did not meet mine. He sighed and for the first time spoke a line that shifted the room's meaning. "Miss Markham, there are living names tied to public relief and to private matters. Certain families ask that these records be consulted only in daylight to avoid distress. The schedule is a compromise between access and discretion." He paused and then said, "You will not challenge that tonight." His tone contained exhaustion rather than command. That answer was specific and it opened a new question. Whose discretion was this? Was it the families, the trustees, or a third party with pressure? I felt the twist form in the ledger's margins. The twist was concrete. The schedule did not only protect paper. It protected people and the choices of people with influence. The ledger now read as a map of social control, not merely archival order. I reached for the iron bolt again. Samuel moved his hand to my shoulder. I did not pull away. Blythe's face went still. "Amira, Evelyn, if someone is inside this room now, they may be vulnerable. If they are a living person who has asked for discretion, we must not force them. If they are not." Her sentence ended with a question. She held the lamp steady as if the light itself could answer. The door creaked as a key turned on the other side. We all froze. The sound was small and decisive. A figure unhooked the bolt from within. The door opened just enough to let an arm pass. A hand extended a sealed envelope through the gap and then withdrew. The hand trembled slightly. It was not a custodian's hand. It was a hand that bore a ring and a thin band of soil beneath a fingernail. Mr. Blythe took the envelope without touching the hand. He read the seal and then looked at us. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. "That is all for tonight," he said. "Dawn will answer further questions." He closed the door with care and turned the bolt. The envelope stayed in his hand like a small, private object. At dawn I left the archive with a single imperfect impression of the ledger page pressed between my notebook pages. The morning air had a clean, thin bite. I walked down the stone steps and kept my satchel close. The lamps inside the archive burned as if nothing of the night had happened. People came in for their morning research and greeted each other with the small, everyday phrases of routine. I felt the ledger's weight in my coat as a physical reminder of a choice I had made. I had learned who controlled access and why they used dusk as a boundary. I had not learned every motive behind each restriction. The ledger and the sealed envelope narrowed some possibilities and widened others. My suspicion had led me to action. My actions had produced new facts and a clearer map of authority. The decision to bear witness remained in my hands like the folded page, imperfect and real. The day resumed. Mr. Blither wheeled his cart and spoke with the staff in measured tones. Samuel checked the doors and kept watch with a professional face. Amira walked beside me for a block and then left with a stack of photocopies to analyze. I climbed into a tram and watched the city pass. When I reached my flat, I slid the imperfect impression of handwriting into my notebook and closed it. The paper made a small, quiet rustle. I set the brass lamp on the table, wound it, and set it to a low glow. The ledger's names and the stamped hours would have to be followed through proper channels and, where necessary, in person. I planned the next steps in short, specific lines. Identify living names, request trustee meeting minutes, verify the envelope as sender. The list was practical. Each item represented a clear action. That night I did not sleep deeply. I woke with the taste of paper on my tongue and the sense of a door that closed on a small, private act. The ledger had taught me one concrete lesson. Rules in institutions often serve the people who shape them as much as the papers they protect. My suspicion had moved me to investigate. My investigation had revealed a pattern of control tied to dusk and to human presence. The ledger remained folded inside the archive, and my note was only an imperfect impression. I had a decision to make about whether to press further through formal requests, or to gather more witnesses to the ledger's logic. I chose to gather witnesses. The next morning I brought Amira and 2 other researchers to the reading room. We presented a formal request for the trustee minutes and for any recorded justification for the dusk schedule. Mr. Blither received the request in silence. He signed for a copy of the names. He made no promises. Samuel watched the exchange and then left with a nod to his post. The action was small and bureaucratic, but it altered the ledger's functioning. It forced documentation into daylight. At the close of this chapter, the concrete effect was visible. The archive had not produced a full confession. It had produced a paper trail that now existed in 2 places: the ledger itself and the formal request lodged in the office. I had not exposed every reason behind each withdrawal, but I had placed a record of inquiry into the archive's registry. Dawn had moved the hidden action into a place where record-keeping mattered. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the files remained organized and secret in their ways. I had the impression of a single ledger page pressed in my notebook. I left the archive steps with that page in my pocket and with a small, private oath to follow the names and the times. The iron door stayed closed that morning, but the ledger's annotation now had a new mark beside it. A formal request for justification, stamped and filed at 9:47 m. That stamped time became the concrete end of the night's drama. It was an action. It was not an ending of the larger story. It was a recorded fact that would force the archive to answer or to ignore on the public record. I walked home with the record in my pocket and the knowledge that some doors close for reasons I understood only in part. And that understanding could be extended only by the steady, ordinary work of asking for names, minutes, and signatures. The day began to swell around that small, written fact, and I carried it forward one step at a time. The iron cabinet clicked. Lang's palm drove the latch down. The heavy door gave a final scrape. I had a paper slip folded inside my palm before the metal settled. Suspicion tightened my fingers. That suspicion is what brought me back to the basement, not curiosity alone. Lang, wait, I said, voice low. The junior clerk Marta froze closer to the stairs. Head archivist Lang ignored me as if I were a draft. His mouth moved without his eyes leaving the cabinet. I stepped forward and slid my hand along the cabinet seam. The slip slid into my coat as if a second thought had pushed it there. The problem was simple and concrete. Certain files vanish from public access at sunset. The rule said closed at sunset on brass plates and typed slips. The practical consequence was worse. Records that mattered could not be inspected after dark. That limit had a rhythm. It meant choices. It meant people could remove things when lamps were low. I kept my coat buttoned and climbed the narrow stairs. My ears still rang with the cabinet's scrape. My shoulders were the same as always, slightly stooped from late nights. My hands smelled faintly of lamp oil and paper dust. I had a brass pocket lamp in my satchel and my notebook with fraying edges. I moved through the stacks to the reading room where Samuel worked. Samuel, I said, when I reached the long table. The piles of catalogue cards made a shallow valley between us. He glanced up and folded a paper. What do you have? He asked. I unfolded the slip. It named an iron cabinet and a drawer labeled Sunset, closed. Samuel's fingers tightened on the corner of his paper. "You know the rule, Evelyn." "Samuel, you know we cannot." "I know the rule," I said. "I also know that on nights when the lamps go low, someone removes folders. I want to see the cards listed here before the lights go down." My voice did not shake. My hands did not tremble outwardly. I had the suspicion. I also had a record of the stamped folder I had pulled once before from the clerk's tray. I had grabbed the stamped folder before the clerk could push it through the tray. The tray scraped as my hand closed over paper that smelled of dust and lamp oil. Samuel looked away toward the tall windows. His jaw worked. "Evelyn, those files are restricted. If Lang finds out." Marta appeared at the corner of the stacks, holding a small scrap of paper between thumb and forefinger. She kept her head down. "Evelyn," she said, "I put this together. Don't tell Lang I gave it." Her voice was quick, close to a whisper. Marta's index was a list of shelf numbers and drawer notes. She had penciled times. She had underlined several entries with a small, neat hand. "Lang moves things at dusk. Marta, he does it in the basement. He already took one for tonight." It was for protection. I read Marta's pencil scratches. The entries matched the slip in my pocket. My suspicion changed shape. It became a plan. I breathed slower. I folded the paper and slid it into my satchel next to the brass lamp. We made a quick plan without much ceremony. Marta would keep watch near the card index. I would go to the restricted drawer alcove before the lamps dropped their final glow. Samuel stayed at the long table, fingers hovering over a ledger. He kept saying small, practical sentences. "If Lang notices, deny everything. If Harris comes, say you are cataloging. Keep to the record." His voice had the rhythm of someone listing supplies. We moved through familiar passageways. The lanterns along the corridor gave warm circles of light. The night watchman, Harris, walked past on his rounds. He touched his cap and did not stop. He nodded at Marta as if he expected her to be where she was. "Night's round, Marta," he said. "Night's round." Marta answered. She kept looking down at the index in her hand. At the alcove, the restricted drawer smelled of old glue and cardboard. I slid the brass lamp from my satchel and cupped its globe. The lamp's light threw clean edges across the drawer face and the stamped folders inside. I slid a hand along the lip and found the stamped folder marked with the name from the slip. My heart sped. The suspicion sharpened into fear long enough to set my jaw. I breathed and reminded myself to move slowly. Marta's fingers touched the drawer as I pulled. The space where the file should have been was empty. A blank patch of lighter dust marked the missing folder's place. Someone took it. Marta. Her breath made a small, visible line. She checked the other folders. A placeholder remained where a file had been removed. The placeholder was a folded scrap with a single stamped number. Someone had prepared a false gap. We did not speak for a moment. The external event hit. The file was gone. The fact changed the direction of all our plans. It turned a question about rules into a question about active removal. I pushed on. "Where did it go? Who has the folder?" I asked. Marta frowned and shook her head. "Lang," her voice fell. She it as if admitting a name could itself be danger. We walked back toward the reading room with less confidence than when we had left. Samuel watched from the long table with an expression that mixed irritation and concern. He stood slowly when he saw us. "You looked in the alcove." "We did." "Marta, the stamped folder was gone." She held the index up. Samuel touched the ledger under his hand and then slid it away. He looked at the shelves and then at the tall windows. The lamps were dimming at the far end of the room. "Then we find the ledger," he said without elaboration. "There are places things hide that are not catalogued." His sentence insisted on action. We worked together. Samuel's hands were steady as he levered a false panel in the reference cabinet. He had the technique from years of handling binding and boards. Careful, Evelyn," he guided my hands when the panel came loose. Behind it lay a slim ledger, its cover worn leather, a lock broken at the hinge. The ledger smelled of mouse droppings and damp glue. Samuel opened it and his thumb followed a column. He read aloud short lines. Names, dates, then the repeated note, "Closed at sunset." He read a row that made the room fall quiet. 26th, closed at sunset. Samuel, Lang. I said aloud, "No, Samuel," voice low, "a different surname here." "Look," Evelyn read this line. He tapped a line with his finger. I read it. The ledger listed names of living people, small employment records, addresses, short notations about family status. Each line ended with the same phrase. Closed at sunset. The repetition was methodical and mundane. It felt like a clerk's notation. It also linked ordinary people to a rule that turned ordinary files into barriers. My suspicion changed again. It became doubt, then fear. The ledger's entries implied someone decided who would be hidden from nighttime access. If the ledger matched the missing folder, this was not mere bureaucracy. It could affect people's safety. We argued quietly over what to do. Samuel, we leave it. We log it. We report Lang. He tapped the ledger with the back of his hand, as if testing its weight. Report Lang. Marta, to whom? He is the head archivist. He is the one who signs things off. You report him and you lose your job. You report him and people lose access to their records completely. Marta's voice rose a little, then fell. Samuel's reply was a rapid back and forth. Evelyn, if we do nothing. Samuel, if we report him and nothing happens. If we report him and they close the whole section. If we keep quiet and he keeps taking files. The argument produced no answer. It produced more pressure. The lamps dimmed as a practical matter. A clerk across the hall moved to a lamp and blew gently at the wick to coax it. The practical acts of closing made everything feel smaller and more urgent. Lang's voice came from the corridor before his shoulders appeared. He moved with the measured gait of someone who had worn the authority of the building for years. He did not shout. He did not need to. What are you doing with that ledger? He asked, and the question carried a weight that made Samuel straighten. Lang, Samuel, we found this behind a panel. We were going to log it. He put his hand on the ledger as if to claim custody. Lang's eyes went to the ledger and then to me. Evelyn Markham. You should not be handling restricted materials. My name as a rebuke. I was following a slip, I said. I wanted to check the card before the lamps went low. There are gaps. You know that as well as I do. I kept my voice steady. Lang looked at Marta. Marta's fingers had stopped tracing the index. Harris, the night watchman, stood near the door with his coat collar up. He had the posture of a man who followed orders first and asked questions later. Lang moved around the table. He reached for the ledger, his hand closed on it and his thumb pressed a name. These are closed at sunset for a reason. They are sealed to protect the living from exposure. We do not pry. His voice held a clerk's certainty. Protect? From what? I asked. Lang's mouth thinned. From trouble. From people who would use records to harm the living. From inquiries that serve no public purpose. He set the ledger down and slid it into his satchel. The action was small. The consequence was large. Samuel stepped in front of Lang. You cannot take that. His voice sharpened into the quick exchange of an argument. Samuel, move aside. Lang, no, not until we record this. Not until we have a copy. Samuel's words came faster. We will make a copy. We will log the ledger's existence. We will send a notice. The plan as if reciting steps in a task. Lang laughed once, short and controlled. You think a ledger is a legal opinion? He asked, you think you can carry this out and make it matter? We can try. Samuel, the argument moved into a sharper exchange. There were 3 quick lines. Lang, you took a file tonight, I said. I closed it for its own good. Lang replied, then show me a record of removal, I said. Lang's fingers tightened. He glanced at Harris. Harris shifted his weight and put a palm to his watch chain. The night had practical rules. They could be used to hold someone back. Suddenly Lang reached for the iron door that led to the vault. He slammed it with a noise that made my teeth ache. The metal struck the frame and the sound echoed down the corridor. Samuel lunged forward to stop him. Marta cried out and grabbed Samuel's sleeve. The iron door began to close. I had one instant to decide. My first impulse was to wrench the door open. My next impulse was to grab whatever evidence I could. My hand moved on its own. I reached for the satchel at my shoulder. I felt the leather under my fingers. I unzipped the satchel and found the stamped folder I had once snatched from the clerk's tray. The folder was already marked with a dampness where the seal had been handled. I slid my hand toward the door's lip and jerked a single folder free as Lang's shoulder pressed the iron. Lang turned. He reached for me. Samuel shoved him back. Marta yanked my arm. A handful of seconds became a small, violent incident. Hands, the irons clanging, the ledger sliding on the floor, and the lamp's flame shivering. Give it here, Evelyn! "Lang, no," I said. "No, Lang." My voice was small and precise. I had the folder pressed at my chest. I could feel the edges of paper through the cover. Harris moved between us then. He put a hand on Lang's shoulder. "Enough," he said. "Enough for tonight." His voice had the flat authority of someone who did not want the arrest that might follow. Lang snarled but let his hand fall away. Samuel had the ledger and held it up like proof. For a moment everything froze. Then Lang stepped back and slammed the iron door, snapping the lock as he did so. The key turned with a finality that sounded like a verdict. I backed away the shortest distance I could find without running. Marta's hand was in mine. She whispered, "Run, Evelyn. Get out." Her eyes were wide and wet. The rain began outside, a steady line on the windows. I ran down the stone step into the street. The lamps on the steps cut pale circles in the rain. The folder was under my coat. The smell of paper was strong as I pushed my collar up and forced my feet through the puddles. At my kitchen table, I opened the folder. The single page inside was brief, a personal record, a small municipal note about eviction and dependency. A name and address, a short line about a child taken from a census, and another notation stamped closed at sunset. The paper's ink had blurred slightly at the corners from humidity. Someone had placed a polite requisition on a life. I sat for a long time with the page spread on the table. My hands trembled slightly when I touched the ink. Suspicion had become anger, then protective resolve, then a quieter dread. The ledger had connected names to a practice of hiding. The folder held the face of a person reduced to a bureaucratic line. For the first time the question left the archive and pressed toward the people on the street. I put my pen to paper. The decision was small and exact. I wrote the name and address again. I began to note what I needed if I were to tell someone or to act. A place to find the person, a time when someone might be at home, a way to verify their existence without using the archive's restricted channels. The choice felt heavy. It was not a promise of rescue, it was a set of practical steps. There was a knock at my door just as I closed the folder. I set the pen down slowly. The knock came again hard. My chest tightened. I did not shout. I moved to the door and peered through the peephole. A rain-streaked figure stood on the stoop, a man in a wet coat. His cap in his hand, Harris. He did not look like a pursuer. He looked like a man who had made a choice. "Evelyn." Harris through the door. "Samuel sent me. He me to make sure you left with that thing. He not to come in unless you asked." His voice was careful. "Are you all right?" I opened the door a sliver. "Harris, why did you stop Lang?" I asked. Harris looked at the folder under my arm, then at my face. Because Samuel me too, because the ledger made him uneasy. Because the night is no place for new rules to be set in secret. Because you looked guilty only when you moved like you were going to run, and I thought you were running for something important." He paused. "What will you do?" I thought of the ledger, of Lang's hand on the iron, of Marta's pale face, of Samuel's fingers on the ledger's page. I thought of the person on the folder and how the paper made a life feel small. "I will go to the address," I said. "I will knock. I will ask questions that do not need the archive's permission. I will make one call at a time." My voice was steady. Harris nodded once. "Then I will walk with you to the corner, not in the dark of the archive, but down the street." He stepped back into the rain. Marta's small index was folded in my satchel. Samuel had promised to copy the ledger if he could. Lang had the ledger's presence sealed behind an iron door. The night's immediate conflict had been resolved by small interventions and a single run. I left the kitchen table with the folder under my arm. The rain hit the sill. The final line of the evening had not been written, but a practical decision had been made. I locked my door and tucked the thin brass lamp into my satchel. The last thing I did before I turned the key was set my pen beside the folded index, a witness to the choice I had made. Outside, Harris fell into step. He kept a distance, but his presence changed the walking. Each step down the street moved the ledger's implication from the building to the people who might still be living with the consequences. The lamps threw their light across wet stone. I kept my head down and focused on the next address. The first concrete act of whatever would come next was a knock, a voice, a question at someone's door. The chapter closed on that decision. I would knock, and I would not do it alone. I slammed my palm on the service hatch as the night clerk pushed a small, stamped ledger across the counter, and the grey-suited official swept it away with a single, measured motion. Suspicion tightened my fingers the moment the tray slid free. The ledger's brass stamp pressed a wet, official circle into the paper, and the clerk's eyes flicked to the shadowed corridor. The rule had been visible in small ways for months: sealed trays, shortened hours, names crossed out in marginal ink, and tonight that rule reached for me at the threshold. The central problem was simple and visible. Some records were surrendered before the lamps were lowered, and those folders could not be seen again until an unknown time. That refusal to let a file travel with a reader was a policy written in lock and motion. And it was the reason I followed oddities through 3 years of late shifts. I had been on the night roster for 3 winters. I had carted ledger boxes under lamplight, logged probate claims, and sorted school registers until my eyes stung from paper dust. I kept a small brass pocket lamp and a notebook with fraying edges in my satchel. I kept the thin spectacles perched on my nose for long readings. Those objects matter. They explain how I noticed what others missed. My hands did not tremble because I admired drama, they moved because I had seen a pattern. Folders handed over after a clerk's cough, boxes tugged back by a clerk's sleeve, a whispered instruction about before the lamps go low. Evelyn, the head archivist from behind the counter, voice low but direct, "This ledger stays." I heard the syllables as a boundary. I stepped closer so the night clerk could not see my fingers fold and unfold the corner of a page beneath the counter. "Why does it stay?" I asked. The question was an action that pushed against procedure. The head archivist's mouth tightened. Lang, who had been wheeling the cart, stopped halfway down the spiral stair with an elbow bent like a hinge. Samuel's silhouette filled the vault mouth before the lamps had been boxed away. He did not speak at first. Each of them carried a different rule into the stairwell. The head archivist carried policy, Lang carried duty, Samuel carried enforcement, I carried curiosity. Lang answered before the head archivist. "Protocol," he said. "End of day." "A protocol what?" I asked. I moved my satchel so the brass lamp bumped the wood. My voice was the same measured tone I used when reading aloud. I wanted to keep the clerk calm and the ledger visible. What does protocol mean for a stamped folder? Lang's hands tightened on the cart handle. "It means the ledger is sealed at sunset. You may read what's out on the table now." After that, trays returned. Samuel stepped forward then, slow and direct. He laid a folded slip on the counter and pushed it toward me with 2 fingers. "Read that before the lamps go low," he said. "And if you know what is best for you, you will leave the rest to us." His tone shifted the meeting from clerkly friction to enforcement. A new emotion rose in my chest: insistence, a stubborn pressure that wanted the ledger open now. The insistence made my jaw set. I reached for the slip. Samuel watched my fingers and did not look away. The folded paper contained a terse line, a list of names and a time. The names were arranged in a hand I recognized from earlier marginalia, the same clipped script that appeared on the stamped folder I had seized months ago. The one the clerk tried to slide into the tray before I could read the cover. That earlier night had ended with my fingers closing over paper that smelled of dust and lamp oil. Samuel's voice at the doorway had said my name then, and now his return felt like the same quiet pressure. We followed the cart down a spiral stair. The stone felt cold under my boots, and the cart wheels hissed on the iron as Lang pushed. My pace matched Lang's because I did not want to be left behind, and because leaving space between us would be mistaken for retreat. The motion of descent changed something in the room. The lamp oil smell thickened. The low hum of distant traffic narrowed into a single, steady sound. I kept the folded slip in my palm as though it held a small, nervous bird. "In the stairwell, Lang. We hand these over at dusk. Nothing leaves after." "Why?" I asked. My voice was a small, controlled tide. I did not use the word fear yet. The question carried it. "Why are some records sealed at sunset?" Lang glanced back. "Because some records require sealing. Because the vault closes. Because the ledger ties to procedures none of us alter." We reached the basement corridor where the cart would be left before the vault. And Samuel stepped into the pool of light. He had a slip folded in his palm like a counter-argument. "There are reasons," he said softly. "There are living people who rely on these rituals." The claim shifted the weight in my chest again. Doubt moved in. If these procedures served living people, were they protection or erasure? Doubt narrowed my eyes, then widened them as curiosity pushed back. I asked Samuel names for protection or for omission. Samuel's jaw worked. He did not answer directly. Evelyn, you know how files can bind things. You know how notes in margins decide the speed of a case. He sounded like someone describing a machine. There are marks that close doors. They are part of the closing ritual. At the processing table by the vault, the head archivist slid a small stamped folder toward me with one stipulation. It must be resolved before the lamps went low. He did not speak the rule as an invitation. The folder was warm from handling. The brass stamp glinted under the lamplight. I opened the cover with the careful motion of someone trained to preserve papers. Names and dates met my eyes. Notes clipped to pages in a practiced hand told me which entries were recent. Lang, you should not have that, Evelyn. He kept his voice controlled, the way someone keeps a river within its banks. Samuel's eyes flicked to the margin. Look closely at the annotations, he said. They tell us more than names. I turned the page and watched the margin. There were dots, slashes, a small cross here and there. Each mark had a meaning in the archive's language, a status, an instruction, a timing. Lang quietly, those marks can mean erasure, they can mean sealing. My hands reacted before my mind did. I tried to remove a single stamped page from the folder to hide a name. The action was physical and immediate. I wanted to prevent a specific notation from being sealed. Lang stepped between my hands and the folder. He used his body to block me, not his words. Our shoulders bumped. Samuel grabbed the corner of the table. The head archivist moved like someone closing contracts. Lang, stop, I said. I used the name to slow him. My voice was a controlled thread. Lang, we can talk about this. Don't make it a scuffle. Lang's breath came in short lines. Evelyn, you can't just take pages. You know the rules, Samuel barked. Evelyn put it back. Now the scuffle turned quick. Hands brushed paper. The lamp shook. A small pile of loose slips slid off the table and fluttered like heavy, reluctant birds. The action produced noise in a room where noise carried consequence. The head archivist stepped forward and said, enough, arguing there produced 3 to 6 short lines of sharp back and forth. I said, Samuel, what happens to names on that ledger? He replied, they are marked for sealing or safety. I pushed, sealing how? He answered, by ritual and procedure. By closing at sundown. Lang, we do not debate this on the stairs. Evelyn, the head archivist, if you take one page, you force our hand. Voices moved like gears clicking into place. Each name said aloud shifted the mood. When I read a page, I found a cluster of recent entries with marginal annotations. Short words, dates, and a mark I had not seen before, a symbol of 2 vertical strokes with a dot between them. Lang's eyes went to that symbol and did not leave it. That's active. Lang, that mark is applied after review. It binds. Hearing the word bind made my mouth dry. I had followed the ledger's path from a tray months ago. I had heard Samuel say my name in the doorway then. Now the ledger contained a fresh list, and the marginal marks were current. The emotional shift moved again. Insistence had given way to a flattening dread. I felt the shape of consequence in the room. A ledger open under failing light could change people outside these walls. I forced the folder open wider. The lamps were being readied to dim. My fingers froze on a page where a recent name sat with a note, a date, an address, and the 2 vertical strokes with a dot. The page smelled of lamp oil and the dust of hands. The words near the margin read like instructions. Return to vault. No consultation after dusk. Protect active identities. Samuel's face showed a fracture of tension. Lang's shoulders squared. Evelyn. Samuel, the name like a lever. Close that. Close it and you won't watch what follows. I looked up at him and said, Samuel, what if protect hides harm? My voice carried the insistence that had started the night. What if sealing someone erases them from inquiries they need? Samuel's reply was not immediate. Then he said, we protect living people from exposure. Often those exposed are endangered by being known. Sometimes the ledger keeps them safe. Lang cut in. Sometimes the ledger hides truths that harm others if known. The exchange changed my view of the rule. The ledger's closure might be a protection. It might be a concealment. The twist arrived as a specific claim rather than a feeling. The closing ritual tied annotations to consequences outside the building. Samuel's next move made that claim concrete. Samuel stepped forward and produced a small bundle of correspondence pulled from a separate file. He laid it on the table and opened a folded letter. 2 months ago, a name listed here was followed by a note. Police were notified and protection enacted. The ledger's timing kept them safe for the night. He showed me a single stamped envelope with an address scratched out and a handwritten line. Immediate removal to safe house. The paper smelled faintly of damp ink. Seeing the envelope changed my doubt into a more complex motion. Part relief, part anger. Protection implied choices were being made, and those choices had consequences. I said, "Show me one where sealing removed harm instead of covering it up. Show me a case where the ledger's mark changed what happened in the street." My voice asked for evidence. I wanted to test Samuel's claim. Samuel named a case, then another. Lang named a balancing example that suggested the ledger sometimes prevented inquiries into corruption. The head archivist produced a small index card with a note about a sealed applicant who later reappeared under an assumed name. Every new named instance shifted my emotion again. Doubt moved toward a conflicted clarity. I now saw both sides. The ledger could be protective and it could be a tool for omission. As the lamps faltered, the room contracted. The head archivist Lang to prepare the vault. The cart's wheels scraped. I felt urgency like a weight on my sternum. The clock on the wall read only by the sweep of light. No one needed to say the hour. The rule demanded finality. The moment before the lamps went low became a tight corridor in which decisions would be made. I made a choice that rose from that mixture of clarity and refusal. I slid a single stamp page from the folder and folded it small, flat, then eased it into my satchel. It was a deliberate, concrete act. Not rhetoric, not protest. My fingers did not tremble. They worked with the precise motion of someone concealing evidence. Lang saw it. His hand shot out and seized my wrist. "Evelyn." Lang snapped. His voice broke the mechanical calm. "You will not." Samuel grabbed the corner of the folder and attempted to contain our movement. The head archivist barked, "Stop this." Now our scuffle widened into a real show. The cart tipped, a stack of boxes bumped, and a single box slid, revealing a stamped edge before Lang closed the lid with his foot. A clerk from the hall peered in, startled. Noise had entered a room kept for careful hands. In the chaos, a small reveal occurred. A folded photograph slipped from the page I had taken and fluttered to the floor. It was a photograph of a woman with her hair braided and a child's hand in hers. Someone had written a name on the back. The image was ordinary and specific. It was not a metaphor. The photograph's presence made the ledger's consequence tactile. Lang stared like someone who had seen a danger take form. "Who is she?" I asked. The photograph asked the question as loudly as any accusation. Samuel moved to pick it up and his fingers trembled for a second. She is one of the names. We sealed because of threats. We moved her." My chest tightened. That tightening was a physical reaction. My jaw clamped, breath shortened, fingers went cool. Fear arrived then not as an abstract word but as an immediate set of reactions. I felt my knees shift under me. The room smelled of lamp oil and steel. The emotion shift, insistence to doubt to fear, had completed another loop. The head archivist barked at us to gather ourselves. Lang dropped my wrist and straightened with a hard, quick motion. "We closed the vault," he said. "No more handling." The lamps dimmed as the archivist turned the mechanism. Light slatted across the table and then shrank. The ledger's open pages were becoming private again. I had one move left. I slipped the folded photograph into my coat pocket and palmed the stamped page in my satchel so it rested against the lamp oil tin. The decision was quiet, concrete, and final for that night. The climax happened then in a single, undeniable beat. As the last daylight drained away and a lamp's glow faltered, the ledger's margin showed a fresh annotation in the same clipped hand I had seen before, a small mark I could now read fully. When I looked up from the page, someone in the stairwell called a name that matched one on the ledger. A distant door in the building below echoed as if closing. The head archivist moved toward the vault and Lang rushed to stop him. Samuel lunged for the folder. Hands collided over paper. The physical effect followed the sighting of the mark immediately. A clerk in the corridor, who had been preparing the outer door, paused and left his post. The air in the stairwell had a shiver of motion. Doors closed faster, footsteps quickened. It was specific and practical. The ledger's mark triggered a sequence of motions among staff who responded with trained efficiency. The link between annotation and consequence was no longer speculation. I pulled my satchel close and kept the stole photograph pressed inside. The head archivist ordered the vault closed and Lang bent to lock the cart in place. Samuel reached for the ledger and, in the grab, a corner of a page tore free. White paper fell like a small, heavy thing to the stone floor. The torn edge exposed a list of names, and next to one, a notation in careful ink that read, "Removed tonight, supervised transfer." When I read that line aloud, I said, "Removed tonight, supervised transfer." The sentence shifted the room's meaning into full daylight. The head archivist, "Yes, supervised transfer." My reaction was not a speech. It was a set of tangible choices. I could hand the page back and allow the ritual to complete. I could shout and call the police. I could slip the page into my coat and walk into the street with evidence. I chose instead a quieter defiance. I did not shout. I slid the single stamped page out from the satchel, palm flat, and tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat beneath my cardigans. My movement was private and deliberate. I folded the photograph flat against it. The head archivist looked at me the way someone inspects a breach in a ledger's seal. "Evelyn, that is an order," I answered evenly. "Orders are for those inside. People outside will still need answers." Lang inhaled sharply. "You cannot do this, Evelyn. You will put people at risk." Samuel's voice was lower. "Evelyn, you know what the ledger keeps. This isn't about curiosity. It's about containment." I felt a sudden fatigue, like a long-bodied animal's limb going numb. My hands were steady. I had shifted from suspicion to insistence to doubt to fear to a steady resolve. That resolve had no noble speech. It had a plan. I folded my satchel strap over my shoulder and began to move toward the service hatch. The head archivist stepped in my path. "You will return that page." I looked past him to the tray where clerks stacked small stamps. "Not tonight," I said. My voice was low. I pushed the hatch open, slid the satchel that held the page across the counter, and felt Samuel's eyes on the coat pocket where the photograph pressed. Outside, the cobbles were wet from a brief rain and the city smelled of peat and river. The night air hit me like a usable thing, cold, clear, and unsoftened. I walked away with a single stolen page and a photograph in my pocket. My gait was measured. The satchel tugged at my shoulder like a known weight. I kept my lamp in my palm and I breathed with a deliberate count. That night I did not hide. I went to a room I rented above a shop with a narrow sash window. I put the stamped page on the table and opened my notebook. I read the names aloud to myself quietly and copied one entry into the margin of my own book. Each written line took time. I used that time to commit the evidence to another medium. The act of copying was not elegy, it was a practical measure to make information travel outside the seal. I thought of the photograph often. The woman in it had worn an ordinary jumper and the child's fingers clung to her hand. Their faces held an expression of small, mundane resolve. I set the photograph face up on the windowsill. Rain tapped the leaded glass. The lamp threw a long pool of light. I made a choice to carry the knowledge rather than to destroy it or to shout it into the archive's gears. By morning I had a list of names in my notebook and a plan for how to proceed. I would not become an accuser on the steps of the archive. I would write one letter to an independent solicitor I trusted and leave another photocopy with a contact in the local press. I would keep one original hidden in the false lining of a coat. Those were concrete steps, not rhetoric. Taking the photograph from the satchel and tucking it inside a book felt the same, a deliberate physical preservation. I did not sleep long that night. The fatigue arrived as a heavy body and a dry mouth. I wrote until my fingers cramped. When the first public watchman walked past my window, I folded the photograph into my notebook and hid the stamped page inside a copy of a ledger I owned for reference. The act was small and exact. I slid the page to the back between weightier volumes and closed the book. The next day I returned to the archive at my usual hour. I let the cart pass without comment. The head archivist's face did not betray what it had contained. Lang kept his distance. Samuel acknowledged me only with a nod that carried no greeting. My friends among the clerks avoided the topic. Procedure resumed like a machine. The ledger was closed again and the vault's iron door stared like an argument. I had expected a confrontation. Instead I found ordinary motions. Stamps, sign-ins, boxes, catalogue. The archive's ordinary life continued around the ritual it enforced. That continuity sharpened the stakes. The ledger's practice was woven into daily work, and to uproot it would require more than a single stolen page. I kept the page hidden and I began to collect corroboration. I looked for the people named. I wrote discreet inquiries. I traced addresses. I found a woman who matched the photograph's name living under an assumed surname at a small boarding house. She answered the door with the braided hair from the photograph and said 2 brief sentences. I left my village. I changed my name. I thought I was safe. She did not ask me to rescue her with headline drama. She for a small, practical thing. To know if her name would appear in official searches. She wanted a list of corresponding dates and notes. Her question made the ledger's consequences practical again. It turned secrecy into paperwork that weighed on people's nights. My final resolution came not as a speech but as coordinated action. I delivered photocopies of the page and my notes to the solicitor. I gave a sealed envelope to a reporter who agreed to withhold publication until safety checks were complete. I left a copy with the woman from the photograph and a note telling her how to apply for legal identity protections outside the archive's ritual. Each choice was an action that moved consequences outward from the vault and into public processes. The archive answered in its own way. Lang found me once more in the reading foyer and asked for the page back. Evelyn, you have to hand it over. For their safety, I put my hand in my coat and told him plainly, I handed responsibility to people who can act beyond your ritual. If that helps, return it to us after they are safe. Lang's mouth closed. Samuel watched without comment. The head archivist filed an internal notice and changed a locking protocol by one small motion. A stamp code added to the day ledger. That administrative change was a practical response to a practical breach. Weeks later, the woman in the photograph wrote me a note. A short line that said, they found me a room. I sleep without listening for steps now. Her handwriting was small and steady. The sentence did not claim victory. It reported a concrete change. When I mailed my evidence copies to trusted parties, I did not expect an immediate overhaul of the archive's rituals. The ledger was larger than 1 page. But the stolen page, the photograph, and the solicitor's inquiry forced a sustained look at the ledger's practice. The head archivist convened a review. Lang testified about procedure. Samuel explained enforcement. I testified about the ledger's consequences. The review produced recommendations and a new clause about oversight. It did not erase the ritual overnight. The final scene of that night had been small and private. Me walking away into a misted street with a stamped page in my satchel. The last paragraph of this chapter ends with a concrete beat. I slid the photograph into a small envelope, wrote the woman's name on the front, and posted it through the slot of the boarding house where she lived the next morning, watching the flap close as the postal clerk took it inside. The envelope's flap shut with a soft click and the ledger's mark remained where it had been, on paper and in procedure. But now someone else also had a copy of the name.